fund. The woman is a genius, an organizational genius.
Wait, you want to say that again?
All right. This woman, right, she created the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund in 1984 and administered it with Eric Holder for a decade or so, right? She created, as far as I know, the database for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 1984. So she has, to put it crudely, the raw material to exercise entrapment and extortion and blackmail of everyone in the United States government.
Actually, David, we're live now, and I captured that last bit. So hold on, and when I come back to intro you, you can go ahead and continue.
Okay, but you'll pop questions, won't it? So my voice doesn't dry out.
Oh, come on! All right, here we go. Reinventing government, federal bridge certification, Christine Marcy, shadow government, and let's introduce Abel Danger.
This is the Circo.
Nope,
They run all
that. I get all the tough jobs. Here we go. Abel Danger intro. And there we go. Today is March 22nd, 2018, and I have with me David Hawkins. David, we are now live. How would you like to proceed?
Well, thank you, Craig, for this opportunity. And I'd like to cover off in the time available the story of the weaponization of the United States bureaucracy by a woman named Christine Marcy, who is the sister of my colleague at Abel Danger, Field McConnell, the United States Marine Corps whistleblower. And just to take listeners back a little bit to my past as to why I have inferred that she's an extraordinarily dangerous woman who's weaponized the bureaucracy, I'll go back to my time at Cambridge University, where after doing a course in engineering for 2 years, I was given the opportunity to do or get a diploma in industrial management for my third year at Cambridge. And I believe the kind of subjects we covered off are not dissimilar to anyone who would go to the Harvard Business School, where from 1980 to 1995, the dean of the Harvard Business School, with enormous influence over many people who went through to have stellar, if that's the right word, careers in banking and hedge funds and so on, would become billionaires. And it's my belief that there are two organizational geniuses. Well, maybe someone might one day say myself, because I saw the MO of these people. One is John MacArthur, and the other is Christine Marcy, Field's sister. Now, in my third year at Cambridge, as I said, I did Principles of Industrial Management and got a diploma in it. And I remember the first lecture, or some of the words of that first lecture to this day. I forget who it was who was giving us the lecture, but we were gathered together in a lecture hall at Cambridge, my fellow members in the industrial management course, and the professor, who was a man, as I remember it, he said, you know, you people, when you go into your careers in industry and become managers, you're going to have to deal with three ideologies, and one of them is more dangerous than the other two. So our ears, or at least my ears, pricked up, and I said, well, that's odd and interesting. And he said, you have capitalism and communism and bureaucracy. So what I'm going to be doing in the year of industrial management is teaching you which is the more dangerous. Instinctively, Craig, I knew that the most dangerous had to be a bureaucracy, because I knew enough about capitalism and communism to know that you could generally find some individual within the chain of command and ultimately influence them, not necessarily kill them or frighten them or etc., but capitalists were interested, I believe, in taking their ideas, and in my case later on I would have a whole number of ideas, including a light rail system, a nutrition system, and a deductive computing machine that I invented back in the late 1980s that tested theories or interpretations of oil fields for truth values. Anyway, that's by the by. So I thought I knew what a capitalist was. I think there's a lot of connotations coming from the other side that capitalism is a bad thing, but it's responsible for a whole bunch of good things in life that has helped people come out of poverty and lead a better quality of life, improve their health and their expectations and so on. And I think I knew enough then about communism to know that many communists' arms are drenched in blood, because if you look at communism or fellow travelers in the socialist community, such as the Nazis, National Socialists in Germany in the Second World War, probably responsible for 20 million dead. Stalin and co. in Soviet Union responsible for 50 million dead. And Mao Zedong in China probably responsible for 80 million dead. And even the most energetic capitalist, and here's one of the inherent problems about accusing capitalists of being slave owners, being brutally frank, most capitalists, if they have slaves, they represent something valuable, so you don't go and kill all your slaves. Now, I think UK is associated with slavery in its early days, and I think that's absolutely true, although certainly the British didn't invent slavery. And very interestingly, the British Royal Navy was responsible for dismantling or preventing slavery. So anyway, there's benefits and costs associated with all of these ideologies, but staying with the bureaucracy. So then fast forward, I leave university. I worked for another year with the Central Electricity Generating Board, which had a very big bureaucratic component, but was basically responsible for the generation and transmission and storage of energy. And then I joined a company called Schlumberger, which moved me around the world as a troubleshooter. And my last year with Schlumberger was in coordinator of artificial intelligence and geoscience research in Ridgefield in Connecticut, where I started thinking about how do you test an interpretation by an expert of anything. In my case back then, it was what's going on in an oil field for truth values. And then fast forward to the present, when I started getting interested in unsolved crimes and mass casualty events. How do you test a crime scene for its truth values? And I make the general philosophical comment that truth is irrevocably attached to every crime scene. No matter how many people try and plant evidence, remove evidence, or spin what happened at the crime scene, the truth belongs to the crime scene. And I think there's a phrase in CSI or forensic economics or forensic research is the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So, for example, outside the Pentagon lawn on 911, there's a line of people with FBI T-shirts looking down at the ground, obviously being coordinated by a guy behind with some headphones, and they're removing evidence from the crime scene less than 20 minutes after impact of whatever it was that hit the Pentagon, US Navy Command Center. And my point is, what they, and we'll come to who they are, would like us to do is to focus on trying to prove what hit the Pentagon when they've removed evidence that would allow us to decide what hit the Pentagon. So they're tampering with the crime scene. Technically, that's known as spoliation of evidence, and that's a felony. So where were the people to stop the removal of evidence from that crime scene? Where was that evidence taken? Was it disposed of? Where is it now? why can't we look at it? And of course, what they're doing there is giving us, that's you, Craig, myself, your fellow Americans, and everyone who has an interest in the truth at that crime scene, the right to an aggressive inference of guilt. That is, whoever removed evidence from that crime scene can be presumed to be guilty of the crime. So it's the one circumstance where you lose the presumption of innocence, simply because now people can't prove what hit or killed someone, and the evidence is, and you can't prove a negative. So they can say something hit the Pentagon, and you can't prove it didn't. So I think that's does that give a little bit of background of where the Abel danger or my philosophy is going? Craig, over to you.
All right. Yes, it does. And what I'm going to do is interject and kind of tie things up for potential listeners and go back to the image I made today. And it was the one of reinventing government. And this is when you started uncovering, I believe in 2010, 2011, you had been focused on the City of London and then the guilds. And then we learned about the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, and we learned about the Senior Executive Service. And so when we talk about who they are, it's the bureaucracy, and the SES is nothing more than a bunch of bureaucratic minions, as Obama bumped up his inventory of SES personnel. But that's what people need to realize. How does something this massive get covered up? How do we get FBI agents or crisis actors that aren't FBI agents on scene? And there's several things that you have exposed. 1996, the Gore Hammer Award. That's where the JPATS and JABS was introduced, or the Con Air, transporting prisoners, or could be crisis actors. You've uncovered Marine Baginski, where you also found Serco. And Serco, as we learned, came from the UK, has an illustrious career, and that could be found on the internet through numerous broadcasts. Now I'm going to say something real quick, because you started off with the capitalism, and I'm going to go back to you after I finish this. But this was a speech in 1961 by the Honorable John H. Roosevelt of California in the House of Representatives. It's about 4 paragraphs, but this is from, let me see, I believe Arthur Schlesinger, who was an advisor to JFK and also a Harvard graduate. Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. Speaker, in my research on the trend of socialism in the United States, I came across an interesting periodical called The Partisan article in the issue dated May through June 1947. The Partisan Review, while available to all readers, is actually read only by professional, intellectual socialites of all shades, and there I'm going to interject Rockefeller, from the out-and-out pro-communist to the Fabian Keynesian socialist. It is just as much a trade magazine as the American Medical Journal or the Law Review. It is, like the Medical Journal and Law Review, boring beyond words to any outside of the profession it serves. Therefore, the Partisan Review is almost unknown outside the professional leftist group, and they use it to inform each other of their plans and projects. The remarkable article I spoke of, the lead article in the issue of the Partisan Review, dated May through June 1947, was written by Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., former professor of history at Harvard and now high in the councils of the Kennedy administration. It is a blueprint of the plan for turning the people of the United States over to a monolithic, socialist, fascist, Marxist type of tyranny. It was written in 1947. I urge everyone to read it. You will see how far this country has advanced under the guidance of such men as this former Harvard professor. And you can see how much further it will advance if we do not guard ourselves against and become aware of the machinations of such people as Mr. Schlesinger and his prototypes. Now I'm going to end it there, and it goes on and basically talks about they built the communism in Russia. They financed it. It was basically a role model for them to follow, and they left capitalism in the U.S. and let that run. And they were seeing which one was the best one. In that paper, they said that us, you and I, our fault is that we cannot understand the depths of evil. And in that failure to understand the depths of evil, we will fail. Capitalism is good, I agree, but you can see that these intellectual elites have hijacked that concept, and that's where we're at today. So I gave you a chance to get a breather. Are you ready to take over?
Yes, that's a very profound, I think, statement about socialism and communism. And of course, one of the challenges, I think, one of the most important pair of words in what you just said is, I think it was profoundly boring, right? Now, but that's the greatest protection. You see, I know the stuff I write about is highly technical, and many people, they struggle because, you introduce a word with not in everyday speech, and unless they're operating at that level, and I don't mean that in a patronizing sense, but that internal group of socialists, what I notice is they're fascinated by long words, because the longer the word, the less precision. That's why I really love, as you know, I'm focused very much on the patents, because the language of the patent is incredibly precise, because someone who is applying for a patent is going to the patent office, which we now know is controlled by the British company Serco, and that's another story in itself. And they have to prove that whatever it is they are seeking protection for as the patentee is doable, useful, and novel. So the patent office wants precision. They want precise language. So when, for example, and this is the method that I'm using now for crime scene investigation, or cloud-centric crime scene.
David, can you hear me? Right now I can't hear you, and I'm not sure why. I have my speakers on, and you know what? All right, go ahead and talk a little more. Well, we just lost our audio with you, and I don't know why. So here's what I'm going to do. We're going to stay live. I'm going to call you right back. So let's disconnect, and I'm going to call you right back, okay?
How's that?
We got you back. We lost you for about 3 minutes, and I thought maybe my headphones became unplugged. So your last 3 minutes, I'm sorry, I don't think were captured. But we were talking about the bureaucrats and how your research paralleled, because yeah, it's tedious. It's complex, and it's boring at times.
And that's an instrument, because what that's intended to do is, instead of using a short Anglo-Saxon monosyllable to describe something, like shit, they'll use excrement or whatever it is, and they get carried away with superfluous and long words. And for the average person who's not in that that community, it becomes incredibly boring, and they switch off. And I think Somerset Maugham, the great author, British author, he said, when we go to the cinema or the theatre, we go with the willing suspension of disbelief. We go to be entertained. And with modern communication systems, of course, we listen to the news for entertainment purposes. So we suspend our critical imagination or reasoning, or many people do, And it's going to be a long haul to get people back into thinking in this day and age of instant gratification and instant news to recover that ability, which is one of the reasons why you and I, before the show started, were discussing how we can lay the foundations in the academic or educational community so people, when they go to post-secondary education, they learn how to think critically when they're getting news from a crime scene. Let me illustrate that with this attack in Salisbury in Wiltshire in the United Kingdom, where a man called Sergei Skripal is alleged to have been attacked with a nerve agent called Novichok, right? And after a certain amount of research, they've discovered, or they believe, that it was placed in the ventilation ducts or vents of his BMW and got inside, was inhaled by Mr. Skripal and his daughter Julia, who were found sort of comatose on a park bench and taken to hospital. And it's very possibly they've been damaged irreversibly and they may die, but I'm not sure whether they've recovered consciousness or whatever. Now, so then the British intelligence and the media immediately jump on this word Novichok and as a nerve agent to describe the stockpiles allegedly put together by Russia or the Soviet Union in the Cold War. But they ran into a number of problems if we look behind the media curtain, if you will, because the Russians, Vladimir Putin, said, well, the stocks of Novichok, or what the British choose to call Novichok, because that's not the term that we, the Russian military, would use for that. The problem with that is the stocks of that nerve agent were destroyed. And apparently by, I think it's the OPCW, maybe you could cross-check that, something like Office for Protection Against Chemical Weapons or something like that. There's a team that would have gone to where the stockpiles of the nerve agent were held with people from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency of the United States who supervised the destruction of that nerve agent. Now, if you look at, coming back to bureaucracy, if you look at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, a major component of that is the senior executive service, bureaucrats. And just getting very human and personal, if you go through the way the SES personnel are treated when they come into the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, would you believe they get an office with a flag, Craig? And that flag is the flag of the senior executive service. You know, that, what do you call it, the stone, the lint stone, for the turning gates. It's not the lint stone, some other word, isn't it?
Keystone. The
keystone, that's right. And they get to park their car, they get a voucher or a decal. And the senior executive service people who are not elected or appointed by the president are actually ranked in the car park with generals and flag officers. So they can park their car beside a 4-star or 5-star general. They can go on these missions to, for example, supervise the destruction of these nerve agents that the British call Novichok, and they can bring back samples. So when the British say the only place where there are stocks of Novichok are in Soviet Union, so Elizabeth May, or Theresa May, or whatever her name is, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in the House of Commons, said there are only two explanations. Either this was a state-sponsored attack on Mr. Skripal on British territory, which, in certain senses might be considered almost an act of war, or the Russians have lost control of their stocks. But what happens if one of the universities sent people in that mission team to Russia to dispose of those assets or stockpiles of nerve agents and brought some back to the United States? So then I did a little more search to find out if there was any research being funded by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency in the United States that might require stocks of this kind of nerve agents to test the efficacy of the treatment. And lo and behold, we discover that Northwestern University, funded by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency and presumably the bureaucrats in the senior executive service, have actually been working on a system to detoxify nerve agents. And in that patent application, we talked about the precision of the patent application. They say this particular technique is used to detoxify a range of nerve agents, including VX and VN and etc. Just note that VX was invented by the British at Porton Down, and Novichok. And I thought, wow, well, how can you test a system to detoxify Novichok unless you got a stock of Novichok? So there are at least in history 2 potential stockpiles, irrespective of the amount in each. One in the Soviet Union, or one of the satellite states of the Soviet Union, and the other one at the Northwestern University Biology Research Labs. And then we should all remember, this comes back to the willing suspension of disbelief, one of the most notorious members of faculty at Northwestern University is Bernardine Dawn, who, in a conspiracy with Bill Ayers and the Students for a Democratic Society and the Weather Underground, believed that in order to secure the revolution, which would be a socialist revolution, Craig, it would be necessary to kill 25 million Americans. So my question to Americans is, when do you think Bernardine Dawn decided it wasn't necessary to kill 25 million Americans to secure her revolution? And I think the answer would come back, well, first of all, the great majority of Americans have forgotten about Bernardine Dawn, but I'm suggesting that's a big mistake. What do you think? Over to you.
Well, I would like to add in is some think that she may have actually been, her and Ayers, part of a covert operation, FBI or CIA, I'm not sure of which, being used because at some of their crime scenes, the bombing in Greenwich Village, there was Dustin Hoffman in his first crisis actor appearance. So we have to wonder now, what's fascinating about Northwestern is that is the cesspool that seemed to come along pretty much close to the same time as Christine Marcy, because what did you have? You had Obama coming in there, you had Valerie Jarrett, you had Michelle Obama, you had Alinsky, which you have indicated may have been another accounting bureaucrat that helped lead this charge. But so what do I think? There's no such thing in my book these days as coincidence. Illinois is in the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, the only state, and in the state of Illinois is one of the biggest cesspools that we know of. So no, them having Novichok at Northwestern would not surprise me, nor would it surprise me that they could be the root of placing the Novichok. Back to you.
Yes, so sorry, and we also, there are no coincidences because the Boeing headquarters office was moved from Washington State to Chicago. I can't find the precise date when it was commissioned, but it's very close to 9/11.
Correct.
Now, what that means is the directors of Boeing would have been discombobulated. Now, having said that, long words, discombobulated is a nice word because no one quite knows what it means, right? but basically, the board of directors and the chain of command for Boeing would have been discombobulated on 9/11 because their headquarters office, which presumably hosts the board meetings, but they wouldn't be held more than sort of every 3 months. Now, what the executive officers and management of Boeing are supposed to be doing is they manage the company between board meetings. At the occasion of the board meeting, essentially, the board of directors controls Boeing, but that would be perhaps for a meeting for 3 hours. But they might lay down strategy. We're going to fire this guy. We're going to do it. So one of the questions I would ask is, well, who made the decision to move Boeing, the world's largest civilian and military aircraft manufacturer, from the production facilities up in Washington State down to Chicago? And let's say, hypothetically, if I'd stayed with Schlumberger, some people said, well, I might be the chairman or the president. If I'm the president of any major corporation, I would say, I want my directors to be within walking distance, if not a short driving distance, from my production facility, and I would expect my directors to spend at least 10 days a year going around the production, talking to the production managers, the marketing managers, the sales managers, because I want my directors in Boeing to understand the production. That's essentially the competitive advantage of Boeing, and the mood of the workforce, and to head off any unpleasant side effects, like when Boeing might decide to remove its labor, or the Beagles decide that they want to move in on employment equity in the Boeing production lines. Now, what does Beagle stand for? It stands for Boeing Engineering and Gay and Lesbian, whatever it is. It's the group intended to protect the gay and lesbian interests of Boeing employees in the various arms of Boeing. Well, that's a minor scandal in my opinion, because any good employer is respectful of whatever the sexual orientation of the employees are concerned, where it concerns the employer. But what they do in their bedroom, or what they have by way of personal relationships, has got nothing to do with what's coming down the production line, unless someone is taking the movement, the gay and lesbian movement, and weaponizing it. Now, one might argue, well, that's ridiculous, but let me tell you what Christine Marcy, Phil's sister, and Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton would appear to have done in 1994, because they created DOJ Pride. Does that ring a bell?
Yep, actually, it does, because in the image I made today of the SEC reinventing government, what I put in there was DOJ Pride, the Small Business Administration, which you haven't even delved into, you have in the past, Con Air, and Tor. So, I mean, all these things, I remember you've pieced them together over the years. Now, we can't go on much longer, but let's step back and look at the big picture for people trying to piece this all together, and how the SES and Serco, with Christine Marcy and Chicago, the Federal Bridge certification, how did that create the shadow government? I mean, how can you justify saying that?
Well, I'm not sure. I don't use the term shadow government too much. I quite like the term deep state. But these entities came up. And
I would like to call them bureaucratic terrorist enablers.
Well, the word terrorism is very interesting because, for example, Christine Marcy was the secretary for a paper put out by the National Academy of Public Administration, which is a think tank in Washington, where at one occasion she was the president. But in this particular paper, entitled The Transformation of the FBI, she was the secretary. So she was responsible for taking drafts, drawing it up, editing, presumably brainstorming with the various contributors to the paper. But now this was during the era of Robert Mueller, who I believe is totally corrupt, but I'll come to that in a minute.
Well, real quick, he was part of the SES as well.
Well, I'm not sure he was, but he's certainly the director of the FBI.
No, I believe that claim has been made and backed up, which didn't come as a surprise.
You're not talking about Oliver Buck Revell, are you?
No, I'm talking about Robert Mueller.
Okay, all right. Well, let's say he was SES, but just setting that one aside. So after the contrived mass casualty events of 9/11, and remember, Dr. Thomas Barnett described the events of 9/11 as the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history. Now, just treating that as a boast, let's assume that that's what it was. In order to put on the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history, you have to synchronize a whole bunch of things going on, right? Including your term about the script, spot, shoot, snuff, spin, spoil. And I think we can discussed that in other places. We've gone over it many times. We've got lots of illustrations. But if you decide that you're going to script an attack which involves someone being able to go into the United States and the United Kingdom patent offices and identify key patents, let's say the Boeing Honeywell uninterruptible autopilot, that needed to be spliced together, all of those elements that have to be brought together have to be synchronized. Otherwise, you're not going to have the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history, right? So if you take the Boeing Honeywell uninterruptible autopilot, let's say a scriptwriter or someone who employed a scriptwriter said, well, browse through the patent office in the United States and the United Kingdom and see if you can find elements that when plugged together or clipped together online on the Federal Bridge, we can synchronize attack and structure it so it looks to the average American like it was an attack staged by someone living in a cave in Afghanistan. That's a pretty tall order, because actually what you're trying to do is to say we can demonstrate that the military might of the United States can be stood down or diverted or distracted, incidentally all war is deception, by a long-bearded guy straddling a yak in a cave in Afghanistan.
While on dialysis.
Dialysis, yeah, who might have had 3 or 4 resurrections, in order to be presented as the plausible figure. Now, the average American say, well, it was a surprise. And I say, well, if it was a surprise, how come there's a war game called Amalgam Virgo, June the 1st and 2nd of 2001, where Osama bin Laden is allegedly the central figure on the opening page? That is to say, someone was writing a script and had written in Osama bin Laden and a whole bunch of technologies by implication that would allow them to rehearse, first of all, the attack and determine where the Americans' weak points were in defending against such attack, and where various elements of, for example, of the United States Air Force need to be stood down. And you can stand the American Air Force down through the revocation patterns taken out by Nortel Networks. Anyway, backing up. So the fascinating thing about these kind of conspiracies is the patentee, that is Boeing, that has a patent for the uninterruptible autopilot, or another one which is called intervention management of flight control computers, something like that. There's a patent that Boeing took out in the 1980s, and essentially what that means is you can override the pilot's instructions to the flight computer on a plane with instructions from air traffic control on the ground.
Well, let me stop you there. I'm looking at Strangler's Suite, and here we have a host of patents, and then, of course, jabs introduced by Christine Marcy. But are you talking about FADIC?
That's one of the patents of the many required to put on 911.
The QRS-11, which Hillary Clinton secured?
Yes. I mean, there are others, almost too numerous to mention, but the important thing is, what is the strategy? And I think you talked about the word terrorist before. For me, terror is an instrument of an organized crime group. Going after terrorist groups is a nonsense.
Yes.
You've got to go after criminal groups and look at the signature to see what particular instrument of terror are they using to put the collective mind of the Americans into shock and awe, where they're not capable of reasoning anymore. They're just accepting this wisdom. So going back to that paper where Christine Marcy was the secretary, produced by the National Academy of Public Administration for Congress, as I understand, entitled The Transformation of the FBI. Now, reading through it, and I've read it, I've got most of it, but there's a number of things that jump out at me. This was presented, I believe, ultimately to Congress by Robert Mueller, where he proudly says that we've now well on the way of transforming the FBI. But do you know what the principal man allocation or woman allocation decisions that were taken in that transformation? Do you know have you any idea what they were, Craig?
Of what they were, or who?
The allocation of manpower within the FBI as a result of that paper on the transformation of the FBI. Do you know what the main movements of
resource Yeah, no, I
Sorry?
don't. I do not.
Okay, about 5,000 agents, and I'm not quite sure how many agents in the FBI, have been transferred, and Christine Marcy and Robert Mueller have a major role in this, from law enforcement and crime scene investigation to the prevention of terrorism. So they
well, that goes to Maureen Baginski. What was her book called?
Maureen, I don't think she wrote. Did she write a book?
She wrote a book. Yeah, it was. Oh gosh, and I think it had to do with terrorism. Yeah, but continue on. Just that's important to note that Maureen Baginski was a influential part of the FBI and Serco at the same time.
Yeah. So anyway, so what the FBI, blessed by Robert Mueller, orchestrated to a large extent by the most dangerous bureaucrat in the American government, which is Christine Marcy, did is they took 5,000 human beings off crime scene investigation and law enforcement and placed them onto the prevention of terrorism. And we now know that a very large number of these terrorist events, they come out of simulations that go rogue. So you can assemble vast resources, including crisis actors, etc., to simulate the training of people needed to respond to an attack. But at any time with the modern technology, and particularly the Federal Bridge, you can watch for the ability of the defenders to prevent such an attack and then basically withdraw their passwords and privileges. And I'm told that Washington went blind, deaf and dumb on 911. And we know that the fighter pilots, the interceptor pilots of the type that Field would have flown, were sent out over the Atlantic away from Washington, so they couldn't eyeball what was going on in Washington. We know that there are people on the ground outside the Pentagon picking up evidence 10 minutes or 15 minutes after impact, and we're supposed to be debating what hit the Pentagon, right, when the evidence that would allow us to determine what hit the Pentagon has been removed. So the bureaucracy, coming back to my time at Cambridge, the bureaucracy is far more dangerous than capitalism and communism, because it creates the fog of war, where people are doing illegal things or criminal things, and it's surrounded by a fog, a bureaucratic fog, where no one could get at the truth until, fortunately, I believe, Abel Danger comes along, and we can apply a rigorous deductive argument to a crime scene to qualify whether any statement made by the media or the government is true or false. And I give a couple of illustrations, which I think, well, I can give three if I may. Shall I do that?
Sure.
Okay, let's take the laws of physics and Dealey Plaza when JFK gets shot. We have the Zapruder camera recording that JFK is hit at least twice from behind, from the way his body moves. And then the third and fatal shot is blows his head backwards, and a skull fragment of some 6 square inches, called the Harper fragment, flies off the back of his head and lands in the grass, and it's picked up by a guy called Billy Harper the following day. Well, the laws of physics, and my, if you will, it's not mine, but the deductive computing machine I invented would say, let's take the hypothesis, which is a government hypothesis or a media hypothesis, that Lee Harvey Oswald in the book depository killed Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald is behind and above Kennedy, right? So when a bullet from Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle hits Kennedy, Kennedy's body or head moves forward, right? If his head moves backwards, it means there's someone shooting from in front of him, right? So there we are. So what we know now is the theory, the government theory, which is the first conspiracy that's put on the table for public consumption, that Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole shooter of JFK, is false. Laws of physics. Let me go to another one. If we look at the Twin Towers coming down, there are 10-ton girders being thrown out on a parabolic arc through the top of the buildings as they come down, and some of them are embedding themselves in other buildings 100 meters away. Well, Craig, that's not gravity. Gravity acts downwards, right? That means to say there was something highly energetic inside the elevator shaft, let's presume, because that would be a natural place to store this stuff. that's been ignited, that's generating gases of the type that would send a rocket into space, and driving these 10-ton girders up and out on a parabolic arc into an adjacent building. So therefore, the idea that these buildings collapsed as a result of a plane hitting them, remember, it's a 100-ton plane hitting a building with 200,000 tons of structural steel in it, that is false. Right? And I'll give you another one which I really like, because it just shows the possibility of prowling through the patent office to see if there's some kind of patented device that's being used in a manner not intended by the owner of the patent or the assignee or the inventor, that is responsible or might explain the particular characteristics of the crime scene involving the murder of Valerie Percy, right, who is the twin daughter of Charles Percy, who was the chairman of Bell and Howell during the period when Mr. Zapruder, Abraham Zapruder, got his Bell and Howell camera to record the snuff film of the assassination of JFK. Well, I don't know what she knew and what she didn't know, but it would be reasonable to assume that if that camera was provided so that someone could make a snuff film of the assassination of JFK, she and her twin sister would have talked about it and might have been seen as a threat, or just used as a device to make sure Charles Percy kept his mouth shut. So they decided, and we can come to the they in a minute, that she had to be killed as an example. So what happened is the mother, this is in their home in Evanston, I think it is, in Chicago, maybe it's a Chicago suburb, so it's a mansion, it's a very nice home. The mother hears her daughter groaning, goes into the daughter's bedroom, a light or flashlight is shone into her eyes, so she's dazzled, but she gets a glimpse of someone who obviously does a runner after that. And it turns out the daughter has been smashed or bludgeoned in the head, leaving a triangular mark in her skull, and stabbed repeatedly in the belly and along her body. So following this logic of, well, wouldn't it be interesting if there was a Bell and Howell patented device that could be used as a weapon that would be consistent with the injuries on Valerie Percy, the late Valerie Percy. So I suddenly occurred to me, Craig, well, I wonder if a tripod was ever invented by Bell and Howell that might fit the crime scene as a plausible murder weapon. So I Google, and you might have seen that, I Googled the patents for Bell and Howell tripod, and lo and behold, you find, I think it's a 1929 patent, a triangular boss, heavy boss, at the top of a Bell and Howell tripod, and at the bottom there are these knife-pointed things that go in the ground to stabilize the camera, a Bell and Howell camera. So you could imagine that someone could pick up a Bell and Howell tripod and use it as the murder weapon to kill Valerie Percy and send a message to her parents, keep your mouth shut, about the use of the Bell and Howell. So, and it's a cold case. So what I would point out to people who think that they'd like to support Abel Danger in its plan is the fascinating concept of looking at crime after crime after crime where there is a body or the body's been absent, and see if you can find at that crime scene the signature of patented devices used without necessarily the knowledge and consent of the patentee, the assignee, or the inventor, where payment has been made to the patentee, assignee, or inventor. So now there's money in their bank accounts, and their patented device has been used to kill someone. So they're now compromised. So that, I think, is a plausible explanation of why the Boeing directors, because what should have happened after 9/11 is, if I'd been the president, and I'm not, I would call in, well, first of all, I'd fire the top echelon of all of my 18 intelligence agencies because they're useless. I'd dig a little deeper. I'd find in every one of those agencies in the FBI, there would be some exceedingly competent people. It would only take about half an hour to assess who they were. You make those individuals the FBI director, and then you say, I want to see you quizzing the directors of Boeing as to what the hell happened to 4 of their aircraft that allowed some guys who could barely fly a Cessna to take these aircraft and theoretically let's take the path into the Pentagon, at 7,000 feet, descend from 7,000 feet in 3 minutes at 500 miles an hour, level off 15 feet above the Pentagon lawn, and take out the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center, which is the major strategic asset that links the President of the United States to the American carrier fleet around the world, right? And you know what, Craig, they would be terrified because they would know until Abel Danger takes the lid off of the whole shooting match, they're likely to be killed if they are suspected of revealing the use of Boeing's patent portfolio in the 9/11 attack by organized crime, not by terrorist groups, by criminal groups based out of Chicago. Over to you.
Well, we are winding down, and real quick, when I talked about the bureaucrats, the key word is enabler. And these enablers who hide behind the scenes probably receive incredible rewards. But in the same breath, I assume that they've been given keys to Candyland, which could be a trip to Epstein's Island. It could be pedophilia. It could be a bunch of things which has been taped, or homosexuality. And so these people, these bureaucrats, I assume they don't have to be killed in some cases.
No, and if you take Christine Marcy, remember that phrase, Mendenhall's baby?
Mendenhall's baby, correct.
Mendenhall's baby in that article of, what was it, 1979 in the Washington something or other? About Christine Marcy and her boast that she was able to have a baby, study for a law degree, maintain a super grade position. Go ahead.
Let me ask you a question. This is the one that you just made me think of. Think about these children that come from nowhere into prominence. For instance, who was the one that was out of Canada, went to China? Maurice Strong, where they don't really have any background and they become in international prominence. You wonder, if they because they're from a Rockefeller sperm? Are they because of a Mendenhall baby?
Or through SOS Children's Villages?
SOS, right. So the plethora of where these people actually come from that are so loyal. But as you know, like Donald Rumsfeld, he was out of Chicago and he went to Princeton, just like Michelle Obama. You wonder if they're being directed and guided into these positions of power. So I'm going to leave it at that. I do have to cut short. So would you like to have any parting thoughts? And then when you're finished, I'm going to play one last video. Cool?
Well, thank you, Craig. And I just believe Lord Palmerston, the great British Prime Minister of the 19th century, he said, great powers do not have allies, they have interests. And it might be extraordinarily arrogant of me to say so, but I believe Abel Danger is now a great power, Craig, largely to the team's efforts, right? But we don't need to compromise with the truth. The truth, as I say, is indissolubly bound to the crime scene. And who can run up against us? I mean, because the other party, I think, are internally riven. They hate each other. They fear each other. There's no trust. They don't have an A-team. And we are mobilizing some of the smartest people in the world. Over to you.
Well, I'll leave the smarts to you. I'll just do the background stuff. All right.
No, I don't accept any of that.
Well, I'm going to play this one video for our live stream, and then I'm going to cut it. So we'll be done. I'll keep you on Skype, so you be quiet. And when this ends, I'll say go. You got it?
Yeah, why do I love that song? I don't know. It's just, it's so zany, isn't it? You know what? And that's one of our greatest. I mean, who can get their head around what Abel Danger is? I mean, sometimes we sound like we're just crazy.
We are.
Or primarily feel, of course. And then, we come through with something deductive. So I would think the enemy is permanently off balance. They just don't know. Well, in a sense, that's why we've got as far as we've got, to the point where now the disguise is coming off the senior executive service, which was just a deeply buried camouflage bureaucracy. Where are they going to go to?
Good question.
I think they face being dismantled.
Well, here's one thing we've always said. wolves are dangerous, but when they go at each other, they go for the throats, and so they're at each other's throats now.
And I thank you so much, Craig, for everything you've done. And but I'd like now, perhaps Marcy. I don't know what everyone's contribution might be.
Oh, hold on.
Good.
I'm gonna end the live stream.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we were off.
No. And